African-American women's efforts during the civil rights movement in Fredericksburg have been well documented. Mrs. Gladys Todd and Mrs. Mamie Scott were both influential community activists, instrumental in organizing the sit-in movement here. Gladys Elizabeth Todd was born in Washington, D.C. on March 4, 1913. Her parents, James and Annie Jackson Poles, separated when she was 2 years old, and she moved to Fredericksburg to live with her aunt, Lena Jackson Alexander, who could neither read nor write, but was able to instill a spirit of community activism in her niece. Gladys Todd was baptized at Shiloh Baptist Church Old Site, attended the Fredericksburg Colored School, and completed the teacher training program at Virginia State College in Petersburg. Mrs. Todd lived her life knowing that having an education was not only a privilege, but an obligation. She taught at a one-room schoolhouse in Stafford County and later in the first grade at Walker Grant School before marrying Clarence R. Todd in 1942. The two had one daughter, Gaye, who I'll talk more about in a moment. Mrs. Todd was a tireless community advocate, creating a playground for African-American children in City Park, now her camp, designing Youth Week activities for the Baptist Training Union, coordinating night study programs, and creating the youth canteen for Black teenagers, an essential outlet for social activities and learning experiences. She was a committed member of the NAACP and was referred to as a political machine in her obituary. In 1960, alongside Dr. Philip Wyatt, Mrs. Mamie Scott, and other community leaders, Mrs. Todd spearheaded the sit-in movement here in Fredericksburg. She writes about her memories of the movement in Ruth Fitzgerald's A Different Story. Next slide, please. Quote, "We were anxious that our demonstration would run smoothly and without a hitch, so we tried to cover every minute detail. We discussed and drew up rules of conduct, dress, parental approval, etc. Later, these rules were mimeographed and distributed to sitters. Lists were compiled of days and hours each youth would be available to sit in. Ours would be a passive movement of sit-ins to effect a change in the policy of those who discriminated. Around the first week of July, we began to sit in at People's Drug Store, F.W. Woolworth's, and W.T. Grant's. For a few days, we were the town's sideshow," unquote. Obviously, the sit-in movement was successful. After a summer of carefully orchestrated protests, counters desegregated. Once again, I'd like to have Mrs. Todd speak for herself. She ended her chapter in A Different Story with this, quote, "Gradually, one after another, food counters all over town began to open to us. We did not merely sit in to open counters to us. We helped to change attitudes, which in turn opened new opportunities and doors to us. We gained the courage to test the legality of many injustices which continued to be heaped upon us. Most of all, we as Blacks gained a better sense of self-image and self-esteem," unquote. Next slide, please. Mrs. Todd spent the rest of her life advocating for her community, caring for her family and friends, and positively influencing everyone around her. When the Reverend Lawrence Davies ran for city council, she made a block-by-block map of the town and found a chairman for each block. The number of Black voters doubled. She also organized poll watchers and transportation. Davies won the election and later, with the same kind of effort, became the first Black mayor of Fredericksburg. Mrs. Todd earned the nickname Mom because so many people loved and looked up to her, and because of the care and generosity of spirit she exhibited. She passed away on Tuesday, January 20th, 2015, at the age of 101. Next slide, please. Mrs. Todd's daughter, Miss Gaye Adegbalola, has continued her family's legacy of community activism, combined with a career as a teacher and blues musician. Born on March 21st, 1944, here in Fredericksburg, Miss Gaye attended Walker Grant High School and graduated as class valedictorian in 1961. She was a leader in the Fredericksburg sit-in movement when this iconic photograph was taken, and later graduated from Boston University with a major in biology and minor in chemistry. While living in Harlem in the 1960s, she worked as a bacteriologist, that's very hard to say, became involved with the Black Power movement, and began using the surname Adegbalola, roughly translated as reclaiming my crown, which a Yoruba priest gave her in 1968. She returned to Fredericksburg in 1970, where she joined the public school system as an 8th grade science teacher, and later developed the city's program for gifted and talented students. She worked with her father on Harambe 360 Experimental Theater and the Harambe 360 Black Arts Festivals. She received her master's in education from Virginia State University in 1978, and in 1982, she was honored as Virginia's Teacher of the Year. Inspired by the blues women of the 1920s and 1930s, the first Black feminists, Miss Gaye has also built a career as a blues musician. She co-founded a trio, Sapphire the Upperty Blues Women, 1984 to 2009, and left teaching in 1988 to become a full-time performer, touring nationally and internationally, and won the prestigious Blues Music Award for songwriting. She composes, sings, plays guitar, slide guitar, and harmonica. Miss Gaye sees herself as a contemporary griot, a storyteller, historian, poet, and musician, keeping history alive, delivering messages of empowerment, ministering to the heartbroken, and finding joy in the mundane. For her advocacy of LGBTQ+ rights, Equality Virginia named Miss Adegbalola an Outstanding Virginian in 2011. Next slide, please.